G'day, I'm Owen, and you've joined this week's episode of the Pub Test, where we are continuing our Jack the Ripper suspect series. And in this week's episode, we are covering Montague John Druitt. And in many people's minds, he is rated very highly in this, if not the prime suspect. In fact, some people say this case is closed because this is the person that we are talking about today who did the Whitechapel murders. So who was Montague Druitt? Well, he was born in 1857. He had two older brothers. His father was a medical practitioner. He also went into that field and was known as a doctor. He also studied law and he was teaching as well. So he was a very highly educated person. And it's not that his family were filthy, loaded rich, but they certainly weren't struggling. And he had the opportunities to do the education and also then pursue these different fields. Now, Druitt was quite the accomplished sports person. He made many cricket teams. And if you don't know what cricket is, think baseball, except a little bit more relaxed. But I kid. I love cricket. I'm Australian. It's our national sport. If you don't like cricket, you should start watching it because you'll love it. Trust me, 5 days of watching people bat and bowl. But he also played hockey and won some tournaments playing a game called fives. Now, fives, I had to look it up, had no idea what it was, but think squash or handball, but the type of handball where there's a walls around you and you're hitting the ball up against the walls, but you don't have a racket. And he was good at that. Now, that is important because all three games, cricket, hockey, and fives, would require a fair bit of wrist strength. Now, he was considered to be a rather wiry person, not solid by any means, but they said he had very powerful wrists. And if you play cricket or know about it, some of the biggest shots you do is the big flick with the wrist to send the ball flying off to the boundary. So he had that ability, and that is important when we get further into this. And as stated before, we're not going into all the gruesome details that we know about some of these victims, but the fact that he had strong wrists would suggest he had the strength to perform the crimes. So we see that Druitt had a lot going for him, but tragedy did strike his life in 1885 when his father passed away from a heart attack. Now, his father had £16,000 inheritance to leave behind, but the sons only got a small amount of that. And whilst that might appear to be really stingy, or perhaps there were family problems, the reality is his mother was still alive. Now, she had problems. Yet it was in 1888 that his mother was committed to a mental institution. Still, it would seem Druitt was able to cope with these tragedies in his life. Pretty well much, we would say, the loss of both of his parents. He was working as a teacher, working in the law industry. So it came as a shock that in either very late November or early December of 1888, he was found drowned in the River Thames. And he had written a letter explaining why he took that action. In part of it, he said that he could see his mental state going the same way as his mother was, and he couldn't deal with that. Now, his brother, who identified the body, gave a little bit of insight into maybe the mental state of Druitt at this time. He had been sacked from his teaching job, and there was suggestion that perhaps there was some inappropriate behavior with some of the students, but that's definitely not in the termination letter and never been proven or written about in anything official. But still, getting sacked from that job, you're still working in the law industry with your status as a very good athlete as well. Opportunities are going to open for you. So why? Why did he do what he did? Even he had the check, his termination check from the college, still in his pocket. It wasn't cashed. And what was also found in his pockets was a season train ticket. So he could get on a train anytime he liked and travel backwards and forwards. So that meant he had easy access to transport. So despite while he might be playing a cricket match somewhere, he could jump on a train, get down to Whitechapel, jump back on a train, and get back to the game on the weekend if need be. But other than the mention of 1888, what connection does he have with the Jack the Ripper victims? Like, he didn't even appear to be around Whitechapel much at all. He certainly wouldn't have known the area. He didn't grow up there. And where he did his education was away from there. Where he played his sport wasn't in that area. So how did he become this prime suspect in the Whitechapel murders? Yet it was the person who had become the Chief Constable of Scotland Yard, Melville Macnaghten, who made the direct claim that he said this person was Jack the Ripper. It's interesting that Macnaghten had nothing to do with the original investigation of these crimes. Now, I will just read you what he put down himself. There's two versions of this. I'll read you the official Scotland Yard version that he said. Said, Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, and whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on the 31st of December, or about 7 weeks after that murder. He was sexually insane, and from private information, I have little doubt that his own family believe him to have been the murderer. Let's pick that apart a little bit. Macnaghten is saying here that after the Mary Keller murder, the one at Miller's Court, Druitt then jumps into the Thames River a couple of weeks later. He wasn't found until the end of December, but by all reports it was very late November or early December that he must have dived into the Thames. The comment about the insanity that he had and on a moral level is interesting, because there is no report that Druitt ever had a relationship with anybody that we know of. And remembering at the time, if you were a gay person, that was criminal. You would be literally locked up and punished pretty badly. So if Druitt was that way, it'd be understandable why you wouldn't come out openly about it. But why this is used, and it will come up with some other suspects, why that is used as a pointer to someone being Jack the Ripper makes no sense to me whatsoever. I mean, to me, it's like having 2 cats, 5 birds, and a dog. And you've got to keep the cats away from the birds, because the cats will attack the birds. But the dog goes, well, I'm not really all that interested in the birds. And they just walk on by all the time. You come home one day and find a couple of your birds are dead. And you go, who did it? And the cats say, well, look at the dog. He's never been interested in the birds. So you go, must have been the dog then. That's right. He's never shown any attention to them before. So he must be this psychotic, crazy animal that's going to destroy things he doesn't like. Makes no sense to me. I'm just saying it's absolutely crazy. But what I think it does point to is the perhaps homophobia that was rampant at the time. So if you put that down there saying this person may have had tendencies that we disagree with, well, that must be Jack the Ripper. Yep, they were crazy. They were psychotic. And I don't think that's necessarily the case myself. Yet, in all fairness, he did have the ability. He did have the opportunity. I don't see a motive, though, here at all. So why was Macnaghten so convinced that they had caught the Whitechapel murderer? Where was he getting his evidence from? Well, we'll be diving into him a fair bit as we go through this series, but needless to say, it would seem that he was getting his statements not from actual facts, but from what people had told him. Remembering he wasn't on the case when it occurred. He's jumped in later. And he's been told some things by certain people. Yet, they do say that this fact that the profiling of the Ripper he would only stop when he either got caught or died. And Macnaghten says the moment this bloke disappears, the murder stopped. And in fact, a member of the Vigilance Committee, not the same Mr. Lusk who got the letters, but a different one, approached the police and because they were being discouraged to disband after a few months. So no crimes had committed, so they say, from 1888 all through to partway through 1889. And they say, well, look, you don't really need to keep doing what you're doing. And he's saying, well, you give us information. And apparently he was told, we know the person died in the River Thames, who was Jack the Ripper. The reason for not making this public is to prevent hurt to the relatives. Now, I'm not sure in that statement what relatives they were talking about, whether it was Druitt's relatives or if it was the victim's relatives. But for me, either one doesn't make any sense. The victim's relatives would want to know that the person had got caught. And I can understand Druitt's relatives not wanting their family name dragged through the mud. I mean, they weren't lords, if you want to learn about lords in England. They weren't part of the royal family. I just don't understand the reason as to why, with all the attention and all the hysteria that went on with these Whitechapel murders, if you knew the person who did it, why you wouldn't publicise it. And the other thing that is difficult for me in this particular case is eyewitnesses who claim they saw Jack the Ripper said he was a very solidly built person. Well, Druitt wasn't. He did have a mustache, which most people said that they saw someone with a mustache. But you see, the descriptions did vary greatly, so I don't really rely too much on eyewitnesses. As we know, 3 people can see a crime occur and you're going to get 3 different versions of who the person did it. But still, he didn't really line up with what people were looking at. The thing I really struggle with, though, is that in his letter before he jumped into the River Thames, Druitt did not make any mention of the Whitechapel murders. There was no connection to them prior to that either. Even though there are statements saying, well, the family pretty well much knew it was him. There's nothing documented to say that. Only a few statements that people are making from hearsay. So what evidence did they have? Well, nothing shown. So I do think he is an interesting suspect, but I don't think he is the one. So that brings us to an end of this week's episode of the Pub Test. Thank you so much for watching. I really mean it when I say it is appreciated. Like, subscribe, check out the books, do all the usuals. I'm Owen, and we will see you on the next episode of The Pub Test.